Thanks very much, Charles, and thanks to All Energy and to all of you for having me and for coming to see us. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not from Scotland, and I live down in London. I have done for about 14 years now, so hopefully that doesn't cause anyone else to leave, but just in the spirit of disclosure and the debate we just recently had, I have no particular opinions about. This first slide is, well, I want to talk to you about some of the risks, given the various changes and ongoing changes with the regulatory support regime in the UK for offshore and for all renewables. Just want to present some work that we've been doing, some analysis we've done. This is really just a prelude. I think, as we've all become familiar with the renewables obligation over time, but now have to start understanding and thinking about CFDs as they get phased in. And of course, the rationale for introducing CFDs was to try to reduce risk exposure for investors, developers, in order to promote the large-scale expansion of various renewables that are relatively expensive, but where cost needs to come down, to try to crowd in more investment to get the scale required to get that cost reduction. And so you can see the kind of volatility in the renewables obligation on the left, where you're exposed to power prices, and on the right, the contracts for difference, where you're not. And what I'm going to be presenting is really grown out of work that we did for the Department for Energy and Climate Change at the end of last year, where DEC really wanted an independent view of the changes in the risks that are facing investors as they switch from the RO regime to the CFDs. And so this, you can find the report that we did from which some of the analysis I'll present here has grown. And I should also say one of my colleagues in the audience, Mauricio Bermudez Neubar, who did this with me, we kind of drew straws about who was going to present today, and I picked the short straw, so I'm presenting today. But this has been a joint effort with Mauricio, so I want to note that. The topics I'm going to cover, and I've realized I probably have quite a few more slides than I can cover in the 15 minutes that I've been given, so I'll try to go through quite quickly. I'm going to cover four types of risk, which I think it's interesting to talk about. There are others that I won't cover, so there's construction delay risk and changes in regulation, which we've seen a lot of recently and no doubt we'll see more of. These are additional risks that won't try to cover any analysis of, but one can, and we've looked at a bit. But I'm going to cover wholesale power price risk, volume risk, hopefully those two relatively quickly, then look a bit more carefully at basis and balancing risk and allocation risk, and give a sense of really how investors, developers in promoting projects and thinking about whether or not to go forward and the value that they can achieve for their projects at different stages of the development process, how they need to take into account these risks and how they relate to each other. So just to, I wasn't expecting animation here, so sorry, I'll try to anticipate those. So the first two, I think, are reasonably straightforward. As I mentioned, under the RO, you faced wholesale power price risk, and you can see this is a simulation, if you will, of power prices, wholesale power prices, and they fluctuate. But under CFDs, this risk is largely eliminated for an asset, and its generation receives a fixed level of support above typically the wholesale power price, and the only time that you're really exposed to wholesale power price risk is towards the end of the period when the CFD ends, and so in year 16 plus, really. So to the extent that DEC wants to, and the whole motivation for the policy is to eliminate risks, this certainly reduces a significant one, which is the wholesale power price risk. And maybe I should say that, of course, the reason that for caring about risks and to try to reduce them is that risks impose costs on investors, and they impose a premium. Investors demand a return when they face risks. And so the more of them that we can get rid of, the more investors you can attract, the different types of investors you can attract who may want a different risk profile. And therefore, the overall cost to the exchequer, to the government, and to us as consumers is reduced. So that's obviously, there are many reasons to reduce risk, but I think one of the main ones here is to attract in different types of and more investment, private investment. So we see that gets done with with CFDs, with wholesale power price risk, which is one of the main goals of it. Volume risk, of course, wind output is variable, as everyone is aware. And it's a significant risk for wind, varies year to year and seasonally. So it's a risk, and it affects bankability and debt capacity. Now, of course, in the long run, volume risk averages out, which I'll look at it a bit later. So leaving those, which are the kind of easy ones, there's then one of the things that came up a lot in the work that we were doing for DEC and that people worry about with CFDs are the residual basis and balancing risks. And I'm not going to go through the whole diagram, but the CFD support level is based on a reference price. And so the support that you get is the difference between the reference price, which is the electricity price, and for wind it'll be the 24-hour ahead price based on a reference price index. And the support you get is the difference between that reference price in the electricity market and the strike price that you've agreed with DEC in the contract for difference. Now, in the period between when that reference price is set and the time that the power is produced, it's 24 hours later, the wholesale price of electricity is likely to change. And on top of that, whether or not you're going to actually have output at that time may change. You may expect to or not, and you may sell forward either day ahead or much earlier ahead, and have to make adjustments and trade to balance the position. And in that 24-hour period, you're then exposed to price fluctuations. And so there's some residual basis risk, and this affects the power price discount that one might be able to agree in a PPA, and it affects exposure if you're operating in a merchant, at least for some of your capacity, some of your output. So the idea here is to try to quantify how much this risk does affect the overall cash flows, not on a daily basis, but over the course of a year. And one of the key factors in affecting this risk is the extent to which the difference in the reference price and the day ahead, the intraday price, the extent to which that difference is correlated with your projection of your output. So it's not so much that you might get it wrong. The price might go up or down over the course of 24 hours. What actually ends up mattering is the relationship of getting that wrong and getting the output projection wrong. And so the reason that it matters is that wind output is correlated. So if I have a particular wind asset and the output is output of other wind is very high, my output's also likely to be high, and that's going to depress the power price. So if we have a power price set, it's expected, say, day ahead is going to be at this level, and then the wind output is unexpectedly high the next day, this is going to push out the Meridor, it's going to push out the amount of supply that's bid into the market, and push down the price. And of course, that's the time when I'm most likely to be producing more than I expected as well. And so I'm more likely in periods of high wind output to be producing more and to be getting a lower power price. Likewise, if my output is lower than expected, that's likely to be at a time when other wind output is also lower than expected, and the price will be higher, but that's at a time when I'm likely to be producing less. So it's this correlation of these two unexpected outcomes in the power price and in output level that matters in trying to understand the net impact of the balancing risk and the basis risk as well. So that idea is one of the things that's captured on this slide. I mentioned, I mean, there are different strategies for trading wind power or any power. I mean, one can sell kind of at the two extremes. One can sell everything a long time in advance, and at the other end of the extreme, one can sell everything on the intraday market. So there are these two kind of extreme strategies that are kind of compared here, the blue and the green. But instead of focusing on that so much, one of what I'd like to focus on here is just the comparison of what happens to balancing costs and so the risks that balancing, the cost imposed by the balancing risk, how that varies when you have essentially different correlations of these price and output shocks. So if you have a market in which you've got high levels of wind output, high levels of wind capacity, which leads to high levels of wind output, and you have high correlation of your own output and the market price, then you have a situation that's very different from if you don't have as much wind capacity and less correlation. So in a case where there's very low correlation, what you have is the times when you happen to produce more, they don't happen to coincide that much with times when the price is low. And therefore, the net impact over the course of a year is essentially zero. There's no additional cost to the failure to predict accurately. On the other hand, if there's very high correlation, so as there's more and more wind on the system, the correlation starts to impose a net cost as you get things wrong. So again, as you produce more than you expect, everyone else is producing more than they expected, the price is lower, and you end up receiving less for the power that you sell than the strike price. Than the reference price. So in that case, what you get is an average revenue from the power that you sold that's less than the mean that you'd expect from the power reference price. So this imposes a cost, and it's a cost that's likely to be increasing as wind starts getting onto the system more. So how do these risks line up then in terms of quantifying them and comparing them to each other? On the left-hand side, what I have here is just a comparison of the magnitude of the risk over the course of a year. So over the course of a year, you can see quite significant fluctuations in the level of wind output from a particular asset and across the country, really. So that's really by far the largest contribution to the overall fluctuation in revenue and ultimately the value of the asset. So it can be plus or minus. These are kind of bottom 5%, top 95% scenario. The revenue that you might get, here we've got 20, 30% lower or higher than average just from volume risk over the course of a year. Comparing that on the right-hand side, what we have is over the lifetime of the asset. Now, it's unlikely that you're going to have, very, very low wind volume output over successive years. And so that's why this, although it's quite high, the variation in an individual year, as you get to averaging over a longer period, the magnitude of that risk diminishes. The basis and balancing risk, on the other hand, stays quite comparable because it's really the same every year, and it certainly has correlation. As the amount of wind in the system increases over time, that correlation increases, and that risk could in fact grow. We've got here the exposure to electricity prices. This is the thing that stabilizes quite a lot, and this is in a year where you're subject to the CFD, so there's really no variation there. And this is over the lifetime of the asset, so after the year 15. Of course, because those are in years 16 to 2025, discounting significantly reduces the magnitude of that exposure. So you can see that quite different profiles from a kind of in-year basis versus the asset lifetime. And if one's debt servicing requirements are individual year, that the volume risk may be quite important, but over the NPV overall return, Volume risk is still important, but perhaps less so. I won't have much time to talk about allocation risk, which perhaps one of the more interesting ones, and it's still really being developed. I think everyone will be familiar with the levy control framework, which limits the amount of overall funding available for renewables. The intention is to ration the amount of support available. We've had FIDER contracts awarded, and there will be CFDs awarded, and we've recently had confirmation from DEC that they'll split the types of technologies supported into those established technologies and less established technologies. So what I've got here is just a kind of chart showing the expected expenditure covered by the levy control framework in one scenario compared against the levy control budget itself, divided into these various categories, that policy categories receiving support. And I just want to, in the next two slides, really talk a little bit about different factors that can affect the likelihood that expenditure will be too high and the budget will be exceeded. So the one I'm going to focus on in the next slide is just electricity prices, and then I think we'll talk a little bit about how much additional uptake in different market segments could also affect things. So what this is showing is that the idea is to try to get a feel for how variation in the electricity price could affect the likelihood that the budget's going to be breached. The reason that this, to get an understanding of intuitively why this happens, as you start promoting renewables using CFDs, if the power price is low, the wholesale market price, then the amount that you have to top up to give to make good on the CFDs increases. So if you have a situation where power prices end up being lower in the wholesale market than had been anticipated, that means that the government has to end up spending more through the levy control framework, or the levy control framework is under pressure to spend more to top up the contracts for difference. So if you have lower prices, it means more subsidy commitments, and that means the framework is more likely to be breached. So this is showing a kind of probability distribution of power prices, and then that maps onto, by the color, the probability that the levy control framework might be breached. So this is the budget itself, and then this is kind of 10% above and 20% above. So you can see that if you do a kind of analysis like this, you can get a feel for, given where the levy framework has got to and how much has already been committed, how likely it is that next year, the year after, a project that's going to be applying for support might be to secure support under, given what else it's competing against. And I guess that kind of brings us to the last slide. Sorry, I didn't notice that was not, the titles weren't there. Brings us to the last slide, which is really just about a sketch of some of the issues that people might be facing in developing projects and bringing them to the point where they're going to be applying for funding. And I think we've heard that DEC is planning to segment the market into the less established and the more established technologies. More established technologies will have to bid against each other, so the least cost one will secure support in the auction. The less established ones, we're told they won't have to compete against each other yet unless the budget appears to be constrained. So that sort of means that they will be, because that's the only time you would have anyone compete against each other, is if there was a constraint, which is the same for the established technologies. And there are a couple things to note here. I mean, one is just that the amounts that are going to be allocated to each of these different bins still appears to be subject to a significant amount of discretion by the government. And so if they chose to, they could shift things from established to less established, or vice versa. And in so doing, because certain projects are quite large, and there are not that many of them, you could definitely have a kind of government influence in affecting who is eligible for funding in a given year. So it becomes important to understand a bit better about how how much money is going to be available in 1 year versus the next, and to be able to track that expenditure over time and see how it progresses given additional uptake of capacity. So I think I'm just about out of time, and apologies for having to go through quite quickly. Just some key takeaways here. I think it's clear that the CFD regime reduces many of the risks that were faced by renewables developers and operators under the RO, but it also increases others. And so volume risk is clearly an important one for wind, but basis and balancing risk is also not quite as large based on the analysis we've done, but still significant and affects the value of the asset and the risk that it's facing, and therefore the premium that investors will want to get from it. The reductions in the wholesale power price risk, one of the interesting things that happens is by reducing that risk for projects, it's essentially transformed into a risk that then faces new projects seeking support. And this is we saw this in the impact of volatile power prices on the amount of money that's available in the levy control framework. So there's an interesting transformation of the risk there. It goes on to the government, which then has to ration the available funding for new projects more. In thinking about what to do about this, I mean, I think one of the things that developers and investors need to be aware of is how much money is still available and what the likelihood is in a given year, if they're planning to apply for funding, that they're going to be able to secure that given the amount of budget that's still available. And so that's something that we'll be tracking over time, and I think it would be important for developers to do as well. So thanks very much.